Years ago in France, the novice master at La Trappe asked me, connais-tu l'épître de Saint Jacques? Do you know the epistle of St. James? And he began a discourse on the smallest member of our being, which is the most powerful in a sense. For the wagging of this little organ, the tongue, can change the history of mankind, for better or for worse. Now, I learnt also in those years of formation the importance precisely of what happens when abdication takes place on the level of the tongue. It is consecrated unto Him alone for praise, and otherwise is idle. And we were taught also to avoid using the voice in the monastery by learning to speak to each other in signs. The result is that the soul, from going outwards, goes inwards, from output mode to input mode, and one then resonates within. A whole world unknown and unheard, the secret of the King. It's a very different mode of being. One day, just after ordination, a few months, I was in my cell, by then in Italy, in our French community, reflecting on precisely this issue, listening. Do you know that a priest has to be an expert in listening? Because a lot of his life depends on whether he can listen or not. He's there to penetrate souls. No one can penetrate a soul that is not known or heard. And no one can hear if he's talking. Talking obliterates new truth. We are giving off output. If you go on your travels to places of great confessions, Ars, where the Curé Vaz spent his whole life in the end confessing, San Giovanni Rotondo, where Padre Pio did the same, actually the place where Leopoldo Mandrake confessed, a tiny little man, sometimes presented in art with a deliberately out of proportion ear, a big ear. His hand, actually, his right hand is there as a relic in Padua, the hand that absolved the world. But the ear was kind of important. Some, like Padre Pio and the Curé Vaz, were helped, and they knew things before they had to hear them. In fact, they would pull them out. Remember that next time you try to hide something in confession. Who are you trying to fool? Well, it occurred to me there in that early stage that I am not going to be a talker. Do you know that a nervous person, a shy person, can't stop talking? It's a mechanism to avoid embarrassment and painful silence. So he'll keep on talking, saying nothing, just keep on talking. He's actually shy. A certain maturity can set in, and one can be comfortable not to have to talk, and not to be afraid of applause. In student days, way back in the 70s, I had a friend who was studying, first of all, history, then theology in Oxford, and he would take me around places. And one day we went to an interesting phenomenon, the convent of St. Mary the Virgin in Wantage, just outside the city, a beautiful Anglican high church convent. And years later, the whole community gave up their beautiful Anglican convent to go over to Rome. They crossed the Tiber as a group because they were adoring, essentially, and they knew it in the end, a piece of bread. I'll come back to that in a second. Well, this chaplain was what we used to call Daddy Allen, High Church Father Allen. And he was known amongst all the students around as to be a good director of souls. He had a trick. It was this. You'd go into his presence and he'd look at you, and he'd kind of look inside you. He wouldn't say anything. So you had to say something. And then my friend would start talking. My friend would have to say something. He'd have to say something else. And on it would go until Paul had emptied his entire baggage into his heart. He'd not stopped the flow once it started. We used to refer to it as the vacuum cleaner tactic. It works. One learns an awful lot when one zips it. I remember in Bangor talking to friends of mine who tried the religious vocation eventually. One wanted to become a nun, and she mentioned this in one conversation. She disliked it intensely when people talked across. That is, when she had started to say something and she was cut short, for whatever motive. Now, the courteous thing to do in that situation is to not insist or let the person say what the person wants. But if one is courteous, that other person who's interrupted will actually not hear what perhaps was going to be said. One will not come back, one will let the person have what they want to have, space. Now that I want to draw your attention to, because I have observed that one of the greatest dysfunctionalities in conversation around the world is the incapacity to let a person finish. When one talks across, one is not respecting that person's truth. One is presuming that one knows more. Moreover, one is answering, if one is answering at all, the preamble. And if one is in any kind of meeting where it's important to get some kind of coherent message across, then if one is answering preambles, they're not being discussed. And we're handling not the essence of the problem at all. I remember hearing this from my spiritual father, Benedictine. You know the definition of a camel? It's the result of a commission trying to design a horse. I want to start at this question of what these nuns saw. All the trimmings were there. In fact, we were impressed by the clouds of incense and the beautiful actual Gregorian chant, which they had adapted to the English. They had their own printing press, I think. But they had a monstrance which didn't have what they were there for. So for years, they were adoring the real absence. What have we? Well, if we have a validly ordained priest who is at least minimally doing what the church is asking him to do, then no matter what his own personal faith is, at that point, his voice box is being used by the Blessed Trinity. The second person is for a moment borrowing his voice box and saying, "This is my body." He's doing the same when that voice box is used to say, "I absolve, I baptize." So, here, man and God are working hand in hand. And that is one big difference between our life and that of even our most fervent separated brethren. I know because I've been there and I know both sides of the story. It's not the same. In our life, we are always handling the divine. We are touching God. He's part of our daily life. When the priest leans over the host and the chalice, he's gazing into what is coming before him. He's handling God. And at that moment, you think he's alone? There are myriads of angels around. And by the way, once or twice, they have been heard in our little chapel in the Hermitage. Today, our little brethren, our friend here before me, is going to receive Jesus for the first time. And I've prepared this for him, which before giving to him, I want to comment on because it concerns us all. People will tell you that we're a bit thick. We need to cop on that science has overtaken us. I've got news for you. It's having a job to catch up with us. I have in here a CD which goes into evidence that there is not the slightest doubt that science is on side with regard to the real presence. If one looks at one such CD, without of course answering, which is actually an advantage of a machine, one doesn't talk back to a machine, then, and I've heard this from a religious teacher who comes here sometimes, these CDs usually get the message across pretty well. Why? They're just looking at what they're used to. Factual evidence, investigative material, proof that there's not here just bread. And there's a lot going on in our time which couldn't go on before because of the high level of investigation going on and the coupling of one with the other. Analysing that the precious blood was definitely of a certain group common in that part of the world, the Middle East or Near East, and that the DNA was what it had to be if Joseph was not involved. And it's curious that what comes out of statues and so on, it's corresponding exactly, quite often, to this very time. Where does that leave me? Our Lord has to hide himself. Do you know that at the consecration there's a double miracle going on? The substance changes ontologically, completely. It is no longer what it was. But then the Lord at the same time has to, for our good, perform the second miracle as well. He puts on camouflage. Otherwise he could not be our bread of life. But occasionally he doesn't do quite normally the second part. And it comes to us as an Eucharistic miracle. I was ordained in the cathedral in Siena 25 years ago, and every Corpus Christi, the Thursday now, our local miracle, one of the two, was carried through the ancient streets of the medieval city, which belongs to Our Lady, the Madonna. The Archbishop would carry our miracle, not an ordinary hostia magna from the celebration, as would normally happen, but what had been consecrated in 1730. It had been consecrated, over 300 of them, particles, in those days quite large, about that size, for the people, because it was for the Assumption. And they disappeared. The pyx disappeared, the ciborium, and it was around the time of the Assumption, hence so many hosts. And they called off the pallium, that's the bareback horse race, for Our Lady. They chased something for Our Lady, it's another story. Which is a huge thing to cancel in Siena. And the whole city went into fasting, and the Lord showed where they were. They were in a poor box. did not consume them. And they're still as bright as ever. Well, we would go behind them. And I remember once we had a local one with those particles, le particule, in Montalcino itself, near our monastery, through the streets of Montalcino, also medievale, and there, right behind them, I was standing in procession, and they were perfect. There's no way that they could carry on for centuries. In fact, a few centuries ago, they tried to make an experiment. They got other non-consecrated hosts, put them in the same place, under the same conditions, and the others disintegrated normally and were eaten up by worms, whereas these have still carried on without any protection whatsoever. They're still there and being honoured in Siena. A hint, which by the way, John Paul II picked up and felt. He went there, knelt before them, and cried out from the depth of his heart, "Ce la presenza, ce la presenza." He felt it. And do you know that he was so Eucharistic that when he prepared his great meditations for the world, he would do so before the Blessed Sacrament quite often. In fact, before being ordained a bishop in his 30s, they couldn't find him. They looked everywhere for him. Eventually, they went into a chapel and he was on his nose for hours before the altar. He knew what it meant to be a bishop of the church. I close that parenthesis, but it's why we had the Eucharistic conference, not conference, but the whole symposium in 1994 in Siena. The other is a reminder to lazy people who are casual about the Blessed Sacrament. It also happened in our area. It was in 1431. There was a priest who was saying the breviary, and suddenly he was called to minister to a dying person. He went in a hurry. He got the Blessed Sacrament from the tabernacle, and because he was in a hurry, he put it not in the pyx, but in his breviary. He got to the sick person, but what was his shock when he opened it, that the page that covered it, the 2 pages, were covered in blood. So he had to go to the authorities, bishop and another priest. And the priest he went to initially kept the relic, and it went eventually to Cassia, where I've also seen it. Cassia is where St. Rita is, whose feast will be next Sunday, and I found this BA here. It's a rose with a smile, and it's a hint that I must not forget to plug St. Rita next Sunday. In Italy, it's hugely powerful. Everyone brings roses that are blessed. Everyone wants a blessed rose of St. Rita on the 20th of May. In fact, one day I took Holy Communion to a good lady in Castelnuovo, and there I took also the blessed rose. And you know, of course, which was the more important. So this, you can bear in mind if you want to bring a rose, just bring one and Lord be blessed next Sunday. But St. Rita is somebody also who does impossible things. In fact, one time, precisely in the Eucharistic context, I was celebrating because no one had thought about St. Rita on her feast day in our abbey. She wasn't feasted liturgically, so I celebrated in the Carolingian chapel, and what was my surprise when out of nowhere the whole Carolingian chapel for the whole celebration completely filled with perfumes of roses. And I checked afterwards, there was not a single rose anywhere, even in a dustbin. It was a hint that our saints are close to us, especially when we honour them in the Eucharistic context. I conclude. This miracle with the missal, or rather the breviary of the priest, is a reminder. We do not take shortcuts. Now, these shortcuts that have come in now in our time, are not just accidental. You know why? We believe in the real presence. Nick knows the real presence. He knows what hosts are consecrated and which are not, and he hates the Blessed Sacrament with a perfect hate, and he will do anything to make it desecrated, insulted, dishonoured. He loves sacrilege. He wants to make people also lose the faith. So he's got the young people before they start, because the message given quite often to our young people at their first communion is incomplete. The attitude is casual, the behaviour is casual, and the emphasis is elsewhere. It's on what's to go afterwards, the bouncy castles and all the rest of it. It has nothing to do with what they're here for. You look around. So we're blessed to have, now and again, little people who come to have their first encounter with Jesus, there where Jesus is only thought about and nothing else. Where the child is with his God, he receives him on his knees, before the King of Kings, on his tongue, and from the priest. They're all conditions which majorly favour grace, because I am quite convinced that although communion is valid everywhere across the Catholic Church, graces are lost by the way the Lord is handled. It makes a huge difference whether we come to the Lord on our knees with nothing but ourselves and our misery, or we come to him as mates with folded hands, looking at him as though we were a bit of chewing gum. And it's going on, my friends. This is a whole victory for you know who. So whatever's going on, listen also to your heart, which might hurt justly when you hear and see the Lord offended. For the Lord wants not the minimum, but the maximum, and even more. Do you know that Therese of Lisieux said, if people knew what was going on at the altar, you would need a police force to keep people out of church. I'll just conclude. This won't do any harm at all. I'll read it to you. I got it from England. Enter this door as if the floor within were gold, and every wall of jewels all, of wealth untold. As if a choir in robes of fire were singing here. Nor shout, nor rush, but hush. For God is here.